I'm standing in the middle of our kitchen, struggling to comprehend what I'm seeing. The door clicks shut behind her, and Laura walks in with Jacob, his face unfamiliar but exuding a confidence that feels completely out of place in my home. "Alex," Laura begins, her voice oddly serene, "we need to talk." My stomach churns. I've always hated that phrase. She doesn't wait for my response, gesturing for Jacob to sit at the dining table. The audacity is staggering, but I say nothing. My instincts tell me whatever she's about to say will hit like a truck. "I've met someone," Laura says bluntly, "and I've decided I want a divorce." It feels like the floor is crumbling beneath me. I barely register Jacob, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. He slides it across the table toward me with a practiced motion. "Before you say anything," Laura continues, as if rehearsed, "Jacob is a lawyer, and he's prepared everything to make this process as smooth as possible." Smooth? The word clings to the air like a bad joke. I reach for the folder, my hands trembling. The header reads, "Divorce Settlement Agreement." Flipping through the pages, I notice she's waiving all claims to our shared assets. The fact that she's thought this far ahead leaves me breathless. "Why now, Laura?" I manage to say, my voice rasping as if I haven't spoken in days. "After all we've built, why like this?" Jacob's voice cuts in before she can respond. "Alex, I assure you, Laura's decision wasn't made lightly. She simply wants a fresh start, and our goal here is to ensure that you both move on without unnecessary conflict." Fresh start? With him? I glance at Laura, hoping to find a flicker of doubt or regret in her eyes. There's none. Only a determination that makes me feel like I'm staring at a stranger. "How long has this been going on?" My voice wavers, the question heavy with desperation. Laura hesitates. 6 months, she admits, though her tone carries no shame. "I didn't plan for this to happen, Alex, but I realized I've been unhappy for years." Meeting Jacob only confirmed what I already knew. Her words are like knives, each one carving into the version of my life I thought was real. 6 months. That's half a year of her lying to my face. "What about Ethan?" I ask, thinking of our 6-year-old son upstairs, blissfully unaware of the earthquake shaking his family apart. "I'll explain it to him," she says, her tone clipped. "We've already discussed custody arrangements. You'll get primary custody, and I'll have weekends. It's all in the agreement." Jacob chimes in again, his voice oozing professionalism. "As Laura mentioned, we've streamlined everything. If you'd like, we can finalize this within a week." A week? They're asking me to dismantle my marriage, my family, in a matter of days? Anger wells up inside me, but I feel trapped, as though raising my voice would only validate their carefully constructed narrative of my being the unreasonable party. "Is that all I am to you, Laura? A signature on a piece of paper?" My words come out harsher than intended. For the first time, Laura falters. She looks down, twisting the wedding ring she's still wearing. But the silence is short-lived. "Alex, please," she says, her voice almost pleading now. "This isn't about you. It's about me. I've been suffocating in this life. Jacob, he understands me in a way I didn't think was possible." I glance at Jacob, who watches the exchange with detached calm. His presence feels invasive, like he's a spectator in what should be a deeply private moment. "You bring him here," I say, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay composed, "into our home, to tell me this? Do you have any idea what this is doing to me? To Ethan?" Laura's expression hardens. "This is why I didn't tell you sooner. You always make everything about you." The irony of her accusation hits me like a slap. I push the folder away, unable to stomach the sight of it any longer. "This isn't over," I say, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and despair. "You can't just walk away from everything we've built like it's nothing." Jacob stands, buttoning his suit jacket. "Alex, I understand this is difficult for you, but dragging this out won't help anyone, especially Ethan. If you need time to review the agreement, that's perfectly fine. However, we do encourage you to focus on what's best for your son. As if he's the arbiter of what's best for my family." Laura rises too, and without another word, they head for the door. Just before leaving, she turns back. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Alex," she says. But there's no emotion in her voice, no regret, no sorrow. Just emptiness. The door shuts, and I'm left standing alone, the weight of their betrayal crashing down on me like a tidal wave. Upstairs, Ethan's laughter echoes faintly, a cruel reminder of the innocence about to be shattered. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the situation, or the overwhelming numbness that followed their announcement. Whatever it was, I found myself doing the last thing anyone, myself included, would have expected. "Champagne," I said, breaking the silence as Laura and Jacob made their way toward the door. Laura froze mid-step, her hand hovering above the doorknob. Jacob turned, his expression momentarily faltering. His lawyerly mask cracked, just slightly. He looked at me as if I'd spoken in tongues. "I'm sorry," Laura said, her brows knitting together. "What?" "I think we should have champagne," I repeated, my voice unnervingly steady. "This is a big moment, isn't it? Life-changing even. What better way to mark the occasion?" Their confusion was delicious. I could feel the power subtly shifting back into my hands as they exchanged uncertain glances. Laura hesitated, clearly trying to decide if I was serious or if this was some kind of trap. "Come on," I added, forcing a smile as I crossed the kitchen to the wine cabinet. "We might as well celebrate. It's not every day someone announces they're leaving you for their soulmate." "Alex," Laura started, her tone cautiously diplomatic, "I don't think this is—" No, I interrupted, pulling out a bottle of Dom Perignon we'd been saving for a special occasion. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. "This is perfect. We're all adults here, aren't we? No hard feelings." Jacob, ever the composed professional, was the first to recover. "I appreciate your understanding," he said, though his voice carried an edge of wariness. He wasn't used to losing control of a situation. Laura looked like she didn't know whether to laugh or run. I grabbed 3 glasses, popped the cork, and poured. "To new beginnings," I said, holding up my glass. They didn't move at first, but after an awkward pause, Jacob reached for his. Laura followed, her hand trembling slightly as she took hers. I raised my glass higher, forcing them to clink theirs against mine. "Come on," I said cheerfully, "you're the one starting a new chapter. Don't leave me hanging." They both sipped hesitantly. I took a long, deliberate drink, savoring the crisp bubbles. The silence stretched, thick with tension, and I decided to lean into it. "You know," I began, setting my glass down, "I've been thinking about this a lot lately, how stuck I've felt. Maybe you're right, Laura. Maybe this is for the best." Her eyes widened. "You really think so?" "Absolutely." I nodded, leaning back against the counter. "We've both been unhappy for years, haven't we? Why cling to something that isn't working? Life's too short." Jacob studied me, his lawyer's instincts clearly screaming that something was amiss. "It's good to hear you're taking this so maturely," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Of course," I said smoothly. "I mean, what kind of person would I be if I stood in the way of your happiness? You found your match, Laura. Who am I to argue with destiny?" Laura blinked, clearly unprepared for my response. She had come in expecting a fight, tears, maybe even a complete breakdown. Instead, she got this, "Whatever this is." "I appreciate that," she said, her voice uncertain. "Jacob," I continued, turning my attention to him, "I have to admit, I didn't see this coming. But now that I think about it, you're perfect for her. Smart, successful, confident. Everything I wasn't, right?" Jacob stiffened slightly, caught off guard. "You shouldn't sell yourself short, Alex." "Oh, I'm not," I said, my smile tightening. "I'm just being honest. She always wanted someone like you. Someone who could sweep her off her feet." Laura looked down at her champagne, suddenly fascinated by the bubbles. Jacob adjusted his tie, clearly uncomfortable. I could feel the tension radiating off both of them, and it filled me with a dark satisfaction. "But hey," I continued, raising my glass again, "no hard feelings. Like I said, this is a good thing. For all of us." "Alex, are you sure you're okay?" Laura asked cautiously. "You're not exactly acting like yourself." "Maybe I'm finally becoming myself," I replied, letting the words hang in the air. "Maybe this is exactly what I needed to realize what's really important. And what's that? Jacob asked, his tone edging toward skepticism. I turned my gaze to him, my smile sharpening. Ethan, I said simply. Everything I do, everything I've ever done, has been for him. So if you're serious about this, about building a new life with Laura, you'd better be prepared to step up. Because I won't tolerate anything less than the best for my son. The air grew heavier. Jacob's lawyerly facade cracked again, just for a moment. Laura looked like she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Now, I said, clapping my hands together, why don't we toast again? To Laura and Jacob. May your new life together be everything you've ever dreamed of. This time, they didn't even pretend to raise their glasses. As Laura excused herself to use the restroom, I leaned back in my chair and turned my full attention to Jacob. He'd stayed seated, probably out of a sense of obligation or maybe just to maintain the illusion of control. His polished confidence was still intact, but I could see cracks forming beneath the surface, subtle shifts in his posture, the tightening of his jaw. He was waiting for something to go wrong, and I decided I wouldn't disappoint him. You know, I began, swirling the last bit of champagne in my glass, I think it's good that we have a moment to talk, just the two of us. Jacob tilted his head slightly, the lawyer in him springing to life. Oh, and why is that? Well, I said with a casual shrug, if you're going to be stepping into my role, so to speak, there are a few things you should probably know. He tensed, but only slightly. What kind of things? Oh, nothing too scandalous, I said with a thin smile. Just the little quirks that make Laura, well, Laura. Jacob didn't reply, but his silence was all the invitation I needed. For starters, I continued, leaning forward, Laura has a bit of a, let's call it a creative relationship with the truth. He frowned. What do you mean? She's a storyteller, I said, choosing my words carefully. Always has been. It's one of the things I admired about her at first, her ability to spin a narrative, to make life feel more exciting than it really is. But over time, well, let's just say those stories stopped being charming. Jacob's frown deepened, but he stayed silent, letting me continue. Take the early days of our relationship, for example. She told me she was fresh out of a long-term relationship, said she'd ended things because the guy wasn't ambitious enough for her. Turns out, he dumped her after catching her cheating with one of his coworkers. Funny how those details didn't make it into her version of events. Jacob shifted uncomfortably. People change, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Do they? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because I noticed a pattern. It wasn't just her ex. There was the guy before him and the one before that. Each time, the story was the same. She was the victim, and they were the villains. It took me a while to realize that she was the common denominator. Jacob's jaw tightened, but he still didn't interrupt. And then there's the little matter of her spending habits, I said, my tone light but cutting. You might have noticed she has a taste for the finer things in life. Of course, she's very good at making it seem like she's being frugal, telling you she's just treating herself every now and then. But give it a few months, and you'll start noticing the gaps in her stories. Like the emergency credit card she keeps for rainy days. Funny how those rainy days always seem to involve designer shoes and spa weekends. Jacob's expression darkened, but he said nothing. And let's not forget her temper, I added, my smile fading. She hides it well at first, plays the cool, collected partner. But sooner or later, the cracks start to show. Like the time she threw a vase at me during an argument. She missed, thankfully, but the message was clear. When Laura doesn't get her way, things have a tendency to break. That doesn't sound like the Laura I know, Jacob said finally, though his voice wavered. Doesn't it? I asked, my tone sharp. Let me guess. She told you I was controlling, that I made her feel suffocated. Maybe she even hinted that I was the reason she had to look elsewhere for happiness. Am I right? Jacob didn't answer, but the flicker of guilt in his eyes was enough. She's good at that, I said, leaning back in my chair. She knows how to play the victim, how to twist the narrative so she always comes out on top. And you're the perfect audience. The white knight riding in to save her from the big bad husband. It's almost poetic. Jacob's face flushed, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure. I think you've said enough, he said, his voice cold. Have I? I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper. Because there's one more thing you should probably know. Jacob hesitated, then nodded curtly. Go on. She's not as discreet as she thinks she is, I said, my eyes locking onto his. You're not the first soulmate she's found while we were married. There were others. A coworker, a personal trainer, even one of our neighbors. Each time, she swore it was different, that this one was the real thing. And each time, it ended the same way, with her moving on to the next shiny new distraction. Jacob's face paled, and I could see the weight of my words sinking in. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, clearly at a loss. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, I said, my tone softening. I'm telling you because I've been where you are, caught up in her spell, believing every word she says. But sooner or later, the truth catches up with you. And when it does, well, let's just say it's not a pleasant experience. The sound of footsteps on the stairs signaled Laura's return. I straightened up, plastering a neutral expression on my face as she entered the room. Everything okay? She asked, glancing between us. Just fine, I said, forcing a smile. Jacob and I were just getting to know each other a little better. Jacob looked at me, his face a mix of anger, confusion, and something else, something dangerously close to doubt. I raised my glass to him in a silent toast, then drained the last of my champagne. Let the games begin. The first crack in Jacob's polished facade came when he asked to speak to me again. Laura had gone upstairs to pack a few more of her things, leaving us in the kitchen. Jacob, who had maintained an air of calm professionalism throughout the evening, looked different now, tense, uncertain, almost vulnerable. Alex, he began, his voice low, can I ask you something? And I need you to be honest. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. Of course. He hesitated, glancing toward the stairs to ensure Laura wasn't within earshot. When she told me about your arrangement, he said, carefully choosing his words, it seemed a little unconventional. But I believed her. Now I'm wondering if I should have asked more questions. My brows furrowed. Arrangement? Jacob nodded, his discomfort palpable. She said you two have had an open marriage for years. That you agreed to see other people as long as it didn't affect your son. She even said you'd been the one to suggest it. I stared at him, stunned. For a moment, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or punch a hole through the nearest wall. The audacity of her lie was staggering, even by Laura's standards. An open marriage? I echoed, my voice laced with disbelief. Jacob, I don't know what she's told you, but let me make one thing very clear. That's a complete fabrication. Laura and I never had any kind of arrangement like that. The color drained from his face. But she said a lot of things, I'm sure, I interrupted. And I'll bet every one of them painted me as some unfeeling, controlling monster. Am I right? Jacob didn't answer, but the guilt in his eyes was enough. She lied to you, Jacob, I said, my tone firm but not unkind. There was no open marriage. No mutual understanding. What you and Laura had was an affair, plain and simple. He sank into a chair, his polished confidence now completely unraveled. She told me you were okay with it, he murmured, more to himself than to me. That you'd moved on, and that this was just a formality. I let out a bitter laugh. Moved on? Jacob, I was blindsided. I had no idea she'd been seeing anyone else until the two of you waltzed into my house tonight. Does that sound like someone who's moved on? Jacob ran a hand through his hair, his composure slipping further with every passing second. She said you didn't love her anymore. That you were only staying together for Ethan? I sighed, the weight of his words settling heavily on my shoulders. Do you know what hurts the most? I asked, my voice quieter now. It's not the cheating. It's not the lies. It's the way she rewrites our history to suit her narrative. She wants to believe I didn't love her, because it makes what she's done easier to justify. But the truth is I loved her. Even when things were tough, even when she made it hard, I loved her. And I thought we could work through it. Clearly I was wrong. Jacob's expression shifted, a flicker of anger breaking through his shock. Why would she lie to me about something like that? He demanded, his voice rising. Why not just tell me the truth? Because the truth makes her look bad, I said simply. She spent her whole life crafting stories that make her the victim, the misunderstood heroine. Telling you the truth would have ruined the fantasy. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers. I feel like an idiot, he muttered. I thought she was different. That we had something real. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence settle between us. Finally I said, maybe you did, Jacob. But ask yourself this. If she lied to you about our marriage, what else might she have lied about? The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Jacob's face darkened, his thoughts clearly racing. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages with a growing look of dismay. She told me you'd been cheating on her for years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That she stayed with you out of loyalty to Ethan. That's why I thought it was okay to get involved. I thought I was helping her escape a bad situation. I shook my head, the bitterness rising again. She's good at that, isn't she? Making herself the martyr. But no, Jacob, I never cheated. I wasn't perfect, but I was faithful. She's the one who stepped out, not just with you, but with others before you. He looked at me sharply. Others? I nodded. This isn't her first affair, Jacob. She's done this before. And each time, she swore it was different, that this one was the real thing. Sound familiar? Jacob's face hardened, his disbelief giving way to anger. Why didn't you say something earlier? He demanded. Why let me walk into this? I tried, I said evenly. I told you what she's like. You didn't want to hear it? He fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. I could see the cracks in his belief system widening, his trust in Laura crumbling like a fragile facade. When Laura returned a few minutes later, Jacob's demeanor had completely changed. He avoided her gaze, his posture stiff and unyielding. She sensed the shift immediately. Is everything okay? She asked, her voice cautious. Jacob didn't respond. Instead, he stood abruptly, pocketing his phone. I need to go, he said curtly, avoiding her outstretched hand. There's a lot I need to think about. Jacob, wait, Laura pleaded, her confidence faltering for the first time that night. What's going on? What did he say to you? Jacob turned to me, his expression unreadable. Thanks for the talk, Alex, he said stiffly, then turned and walked out the door without another word. Laura stood frozen, her eyes darting between me and the now closed door. What did you say to him? She demanded, her voice sharp with panic. I met her gaze, my expression calm. The truth, I said simply. For the first time, Laura looked genuinely afraid. And for the first time, I felt like I'd finally taken back control. The silence that followed Jacob's departure was thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. Laura stood in the kitchen, frozen, her eyes flicking between the door Jacob had just walked through into me. Her confident facade had been stripped away, leaving a flicker of desperation in her eyes. What did you say to him? She repeated, her voice sharper now, teetering on the edge of panic. I shrugged, leaning casually against the counter. I told him the truth, Laura. That's all. The truth about our marriage, about your lies, about who you really are. Her face twisted, a mix of anger and fear. You're lying, she spat. Jacob knows me. He loves me. He wouldn't just walk out like that unless you... Unless I what? I cut in, my voice cold. Unless I showed him the cracks in the fantasy you've been feeding him? Come on, Laura. You've been spinning these stories for so long you probably don't even know what the truth looks like anymore. Before she could respond, a voice from the doorway shattered the tension. Is it true, Mom? Laura spun around, and there they were, Ben and Sophie, our children. Ben, at 14, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of betrayal and anger that made him look years older. Sophie, only 6, clung to her brother's side, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Ben, what are you doing down here? Laura stammered, her voice suddenly soft, almost motherly. I thought you were upstairs. We were, Ben interrupted, his voice steady but laced with hurt. Until Sophie heard you talking and got scared. I came down to check and then... He trailed off, his glare intensifying. Then I heard everything. Laura's face paled, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Ben, sweetheart, you don't understand. Don't call me that, he snapped, his voice cracking with emotion. Don't pretend like you care about us right now. I heard Dad telling Jacob everything. I heard about the other guys. I heard about you lying to Jacob about having an open marriage. And you know what? It makes sense now. All those nights you came home late and acted like nothing was wrong. All those times you told us you were working but we knew you weren't. Sophie tugged on Ben's arm, her voice small and shaky. Mommy, why are you yelling at Daddy? She asked, her innocence cutting through the chaos like a knife. Did you do something bad? Laura opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting between me and the kids as if searching for an escape route. Ben, I said gently, stepping forward, take Sophie upstairs. No, Ben said firmly, standing his ground. I'm not going anywhere. Not until Mom tells us the truth. Laura's desperation boiled over. This isn't fair, she cried, her voice breaking. Alex, how could you do this? How could you turn the kids against me? I didn't have to, I replied, my tone measured. You did that all on your own. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen this act before, the crocodile tears, the pleas for sympathy. It wouldn't work this time, not with me, and certainly not with Ben. He was too much like me, too observant, too sharp. He'd seen through her the way I finally had. Mom, is it true? Ben pressed, his voice trembling. Did you cheat on Dad? Laura's silence was deafening. Sophie started to cry, burying her face in Ben's side. Why is everyone so mad? She whimpered. I don't like this. I moved to kneel in front of her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Hey, it's okay, sweetheart, I said softly. No one's mad at you. This isn't your fault. She looked up at me, her big, tear-filled eyes breaking my heart. Promise? I promise, I said, pulling her into a hug. Everything's going to be okay. But even as I said the words, I knew they were only half true. Things might be okay eventually, but not tonight. Tonight, everything was falling apart. Ben, take Sophie upstairs, I repeated, my tone firmer this time. She doesn't need to be here for this. Ben hesitated, his protective instincts warring with his anger. Finally, he nodded, taking Sophie's hand. Come on, he said gently. Let's go. As they disappeared up the stairs, Laura seemed to collapse in on herself. She sank into a chair, her head in her hands, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. You've ruined everything, she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, Laura, I said, my voice hard. You did. You lied to Jacob, to me, to the kids. You built this house of cards, and now you're surprised it's all come crashing down? She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face twisted with anger. You think you're so righteous, don't you? You think you've won? This isn't about winning, I said coldly. It's about the truth. Something you've spent your whole life running from. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I can't stay here, she muttered, more to herself than to me. I need to go. Where are you going to run, Laura? I asked, crossing my arms. Jacob's gone. The kids know the truth. What's left? She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her coat and bag, her movements frantic. I'll come back for my things, she said, her voice trembling. When things have calmed down. And when will that be? I asked, my tone biting. After you've found someone else to spin your stories to? Someone else to blame for your mistakes? She didn't respond. She just fled, out the door and into the night, leaving behind the ruins of the life she tried so hard to control. As the door slammed shut, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't victory. It wasn't closure. But it was something, a step toward rebuilding what she tried to destroy. Upstairs, I could hear Sophie's quiet sobs and Ben's murmured reassurances. I knew there was a long road ahead, filled with difficult conversations and painful truths. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a chance, a real chance, to move forward. And without Laura, I knew we'd be better off.